Hello, everyone, and welcome to MisterStuTV Live. Today we are talking about our journey to healing. I'm going to be discussing childhood trauma with you and just what are some of the symptoms of childhood trauma? What are some of the differences maybe that a child who's experienced trauma is could show differences than their peers who have not experienced those traumas, and then kind of just how trauma is a general principle that we all face now, especially after a worldwide pandemic. I'm very excited to talk with you about it. But before we jump into that, I want to remind you to make sure to follow at MisterStuTV on YouTube and YouTube Kids. There we have all sorts of resources. We have these Facebook Live replays as well as episodes that discuss different emotions for children. And we make tough emotions child's play over there. Make sure to check it out, MisterStuTV on YouTube and YouTube Kids. And then also coming up in a few weeks, July 9th at 2 p.m., there will be another Facebook Live event. This one is all about loving limits, and it will be talking about positive discipline strategies to use. A few weeks ago, we did the great spank debate where we talked about whether spanking was or was not a positive discipline practice. You can go back and watch that video on YouTube. But at this Facebook Live about loving limits, we'll discuss alternative strategies that you can use to help create limits and boundaries for your child, but allow them to grow outside of certain limits as well. I'm excited to share with you about that. But today we're talking about a journey to healing. And so many times we, as therapists, discuss childhood trauma and just all the difficulties that come up because of trauma experienced as a child. So today I'm excited. I hate that this conversation is necessary, but I hope that by the end of our time together today, you'll understand a bit more about trauma and its impact on children, so that maybe, yes, you can have empathy for their situation and empathy for the things that they've gone through, but I'm hoping that today you can also gain some empathy that even while they're acting out, even if they are having a tantrum, that you can have empathy that it's not their choosing to just do something bad for the sake of doing something bad, but that really there have been some things that have happened to them through the traumas that have happened in their brain that, yes, they can be undone, and yes, they can be worked through, but it takes time and the proper support with empathy. So today, that's what I'm hoping you can gain out of our presentation. Let's talk first about what is trauma. Let's define trauma, especially as we'll be talking about it today. My basic definition of trauma is just experiencing anything that you were not made to experience. Anything. That could be death of a family member, death of a loved one. It could be abuse of some kind. It could also be a worldwide pandemic. Experiencing something that no one was ever meant to experience. Right now, as therapists, we see a lot of children with high levels of stress and anxiety, not because something has specifically happened to them, but because of the trauma and the traumatic stress as they've experienced a worldwide pandemic. They were pulled out of schools. They were told that they could die from this disease. They maybe had loved ones die from this illness. And because of that, children are now at a heightened sense of trauma. It doesn't mean that they were abused, and it doesn't mean that it can't be undone, but what it does mean is that children and adults now have all experienced something that they were never made to experience, and because of that, we are experiencing trauma. Trauma, it's like an unwelcome visitor that comes in and then leaves an impact on our lives. And then because of that event, because of that visitor, because of that visitation of this event that was never supposed to take place, there can be a deep emotional response to that event. There are different types of childhood trauma. I just talked about the worldwide pandemic. That is one form of trauma, but it might come in a natural disaster. Maybe a child out in California is experiencing trauma from wildfires that are happening out there. Or a child living in Florida sees a hurricane and can become very distressed and traumatized because of that natural disaster. It could be that they experienced violence. Now, experiencing doesn't necessarily mean that the violence happened to them. It could be that way. Or they witnessed, so they can experience it through witnessing it happening to someone that they care about deeply. It could be a domestic violence situation. It could be an abusive situation. It could be a criminal situation outside of the home. There's all sorts of different ways that children experience these traumas. And in today's world, unfortunately, there are so many more examples. There are shooters that go into schools. There are people just spreading hatred all over the media. There are all sorts of things that children are dealing with now that maybe you didn't think of as traumas. But when you think of trauma as something that you experience that you were never made to experience, it makes a whole lot of sense why children are at this heightened sense of stress and anxiety in today's world. It can impact their development, and it can impact their mental and emotional well-being. That is really important to understand, that it can impact the development of a child. There's a phenomenon in mental health and in therapy where we understand that if someone experienced an intense childhood trauma and that trauma is unresolved, that there may be times, or even a majority of the time, where that person will behave as if they are the age and developmental level that they were at when the trauma happened. That is something to understand, that yes, your 15-year-old might be acting like an 8-year-old or younger, but was there something that happened when they were that young that is causing them to revert back? It can also just delay development. When we talk about needs and needs being met, there's a concept that's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And basically, self-actualization is at the top, that feeling of you are making a difference in the world and you matter individually. Well, at the bottom are these physiological needs of just food, water, shelter, safety. Those things are at the bottom. And the theory is, and it's been proven, that if those lower level needs, that safety, shelter, food, clothing, if those things are not met, then children can't progress higher to more complex needs like relationships or like self-actualization. So if a child is in a dangerous situation or in a situation where they feel unsafe, then they'll be trapped in that level. They won't be able to do things like learn at school because those lower level needs are not yet being met. And so it's important as a caregiver of a child to ensure that those lower level needs of safety, of food and clothing and shelter, those things are taken care of if we expect for children to be able to grow at a developmentally appropriate level. It's almost like a shadow that just always stays there with the child, that they just can't seem to shake it, and it's kind of part of them but kind of not part of them, and it doesn't exactly show what was going on, but it's this shadow that gets cast when children experience these difficult things. Let's talk about some common symptoms so that as caregivers of children, you may be able to recognize trauma in children and be able to support them. First, you have to know that there is a problem. So let's talk about some common symptoms in children who have experienced a traumatic event. There are some emotional and behavioral symptoms. Children wear their emotions on their sleeve. But children affected by trauma might wear their emotions more like a really heavy coat. And rather than being able to wear them on your sleeve and let them go, this heavy coat is weighing you down and you can't really seem to shake it. It may seem that these children appear more sad more often or more intensely than other children. The same can be true of fear. They may feel it more often or more intensely than other children because of some things that have happened in their brain that make those parts of their brain more sensitive. So the emotional symptoms are important to note. There's also academic and social challenges that children go through if they have experienced trauma. We just talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if children's lower level needs are not being met, they're not going to be able to focus enough to learn about math or learn about reading or learn about science, whatever it might be, because those lower level needs need to be met first. It could be that these kids have trouble keeping up with their peers, both in the classroom and on the playground, because they're dealing with these lingering effects of what they've experienced. Just like we talked about with the hierarchy of needs, well, social relationships are higher level needs than safety, food, water, shelter, all those things. So if children aren't having those lower level needs met, they'll also have difficulty making friends. They'll also have difficulty learning. And so it could be that at school you see a lot of these challenges start to manifest. Children often will show signs that they're just letting out a cry for help. If a child is constantly tantruming, what they're saying is, I need someone to help me stay in control of this. So if you're seeing those things, rather than saying, oh, why would they do that? Try to shift your thinking into, what happened that made them think this is the way to deal with that situation. So now that we have this understanding of some common symptoms and how trauma looks as this event that was never supposed to be experienced, let's talk a little bit about the brain structure and chemistry of children who have experienced trauma versus those who have not. There's a couple key differences. One is in the role of this tiny little piece. It's about the size of an almond, and it's called the amygdala. The amygdala sits in the middle of the brain, and it does a lot of different things, but one of its main jobs is it acts as the body's alarm system, the body's smoke detector, and it lets the brain and the body know if there's something that's dangerous that's going on. Children who have experienced trauma, their amygdalas have more sensitivity to them. It could be that a sound happens, and to most people, that sound wouldn't mean anything. But to them, it reminds them of the trauma, and so their amygdala, that alarm system, sets off an alarm and says, this is unsafe. They might see someone who reminds them of someone else, and their amygdala goes off and says, this must not be safe. Could be they smell something and it reminds them of the trauma, and their amygdala goes off and says, this must not be safe. So that amygdala, that's the thing that can have the heightened levels of fear and sadness in children, because as it's firing, the child is saying, there's something wrong here. And everybody's looking around saying, this looks very safe. It looks like this shouldn't be a problem right now, but they are really having a difficult time. It's because their amygdala is going off and letting them know this must not be safe. So the child can panic. That leads then to a response that's called a fight, flight, freeze response. There's actually 5 different responses, but fight, flight, and freeze are the 3 main ones that we see in children who have experienced trauma. When that amygdala goes off and says, there's something dangerous here, this must not be safe, it actually shuts off functions of the brain that control things like being able to think through a situation, to respond rather than to react, and to synthesize information and really make sense of it all. The amygdala cuts off all of that access. So as children are experiencing this amygdala having gone off and telling them this must not be safe, their cognitive level is also very limited. So their brain tells them we either need to run away, we need to fight this thing, or we just need to freeze and hope that it stops. That fight, flight, freeze, either fight it, run towards it, flight, run away from it, or freeze up and just hope that it stops. Those things happen when that amygdala fires. So now we have a situation where a child has a more sensitive amygdala that goes off more often and leads to these difficult behaviors, like fight in children may look like a tantrum or destroying a classroom. Flight may look like running away from mom or dad, running out of a classroom, running out of a school. Freeze may look like just a child who is being defiant, and they're just saying they're not going to do whatever it might be, but really they might be trapped in that fight, flight, or freeze. There is also some long-term effects if trauma is not dealt with appropriately. If it's not supported and given empathy, then children can have some long-term effects on their development, which we talked about, and on their ability to function. That heightened sense in the amygdala can also make it very difficult for children to control their emotions. If their brain gets hijacked by that amygdala going off and saying, this must not be safe, then the child doesn't learn how to calm themselves down because the brain doesn't have access to those pieces that can teach that skill or remind them of that skill when they are at that heightened, all alerts going off sense in their brain. So let's talk about then a way to help a child who has kicked into this fight, flight, freeze mode, and how you can help them calm back down, because it's not as easy as just saying, hey, stop doing that. If you do that, you could be met with either a more scared child or a more aggressive child. So let's talk about a way that you can support children through this method that Dan Siegel calls the regulate, relate, reason method. Dan Siegel is a doctor as well as a child and family therapist, and he wrote a book called The Whole Brain Child along with Tina Bryson, I believe is her name. And Dr. Siegel talks about this method called regulate, relate, reason that can help to de-escalate a tantrum when a child is in the middle of it. The thing that most adults go to when a child is tantruming is they go right to reasoning. They go right to, this is the wrong thing to be doing. You shouldn't be doing this. Understand this. It's that reasoning piece. And you jump right to reasoning. Well, if a child is in a tantrum mode, it's likely that that amygdala has gone off and they don't have access to their reasoning skills. So what you have to do is help them regulate, then you can relate to them, then you can reason with them. The way to do that is step 1, regulate. Help them to understand what emotion it is they're feeling and help them to calm it down. So it could be that you go over, you put your arm around them and you say, oh, I can tell that you are so angry right now. And once you say that, once you signal that, what you're saying to the child is, I see you are not bad. This emotion is tough. That's the regulate skill. It's helping a child to understand that they are in control. This is outside of them. It's inside their mind, but it's It is not who they are. They are not controlled by this emotion. They can overcome this emotion. So if you'll go over and be with them, whether it's with your arm around them or just sitting right there with them or down on your knees, just looking at them, whatever it might be, you're helping them regulate. You're helping them calm down. You're helping that amygdala to stop saying, this is not safe, this is not safe. So you've got to talk calmly and quietly. You've got to make sure that the child knows that you're there to help, that you are there with understanding, and that you see that they are facing a difficult time. If you'll do that, you will see automatically in the child, they'll start to come down a little bit. If a child is upset because you're not buying them a toy at the store and their amygdala for some reason has gone off and said, this must not be safe because my needs are not being met, then you can look at them and you can say, I know you can feel really sad when you don't get the toy that you want. And if you say that, do you see how much of a difference that is than looking at your child and saying, we are not doing that in this store. Now, yes, you can get to that. You can get to a consequence, or you can get to, hey, that's not how I want you to act in this situation. That's the reason part, but that's not how you start. That's not the way you start with a child. You start with regulate by helping them identify that they are feeling an emotion and it is controllable. That's regulate. And if you'll do that, you'll see that their stress and anxiety will start to come down, and then they might start to be willing to listen to you. Next step is relate. So you've regulated, you've helped them understand their emotion, and you've helped them understand that they can control it. Then you're going to relate to the child. What that means is you're going to tell them that there's been times you felt that way too. There's been times that other people have felt that way. And look, you're right here and it's okay. So it must be that this emotion they're feeling, this situation that they're feeling is not dangerous. It just doesn't feel good. By doing that, it helps children to understand that they are not freaks, that they are not monsters, but that they are just experiencing something that other people have experienced that's really difficult. Imagine going to a doctor and the doctor says, I have no idea what's wrong with you. You might experience this forever. This might be the thing that kills you. Well, that is much different from going to the doctor and the doctor saying, you've got the flu. I've helped tons of patients with this. It'll be about a week of feeling pretty bad, and then you will be just fine. Don't even worry about it. Both situations are still difficult. They're not fun, but one leaves you with this sense of fear and anxiety and stress, and the other leaves you with, okay, this might not be very fun, but I'm going to make it right through. That's what regulate and relate do for a child. It names it, gives it a diagnosis. You are diagnosed with frustration right now. You are diagnosed with sadness right now, whatever it might be. And then relate is, don't worry, we've been through this before, you've been through this before, I've been through this before, and we're going to make it through again. Then finally is that reasoning. So after the child has come down, after the child has related with you, and you can see that they are in a mode where their brain is back online and they are making the choices again, then you can say, I know that you were really sad, but that doesn't mean you get to scream in the store. Next time you can look at me and say, that makes me really sad. I know that was a lame example, but let's take it for what it's worth. That's how you can integrate this whole system, is to regulate, then relate, then reason. So I see that you are feeling really upset that you don't get the toy. It can be so hard to feel frustrated. It can be so hard to feel sad, especially when you want that toy. There have been other times you felt that way and you've made it through. I know it's not very fun, but you did it. And I know you've done a great job of calming down this time, but I want to remind you that just because you're sad in the store doesn't mean that you get to start screaming and throwing yourself on the ground and punching. You don't get to do those things. Next time, you can squeeze my hand, or you can take some deep breaths, or you can just tell me that you need a break or that you need some help. Then you have gone all the way through those steps. Regulate, then relate, then reason. And if you'll do that, then you're loosening up that amygdala, you're letting it calm back down, and you're helping the child to see, oh, I thought that this wasn't safe, but it must be because everything is just fine now. That is a very brief overview of childhood trauma, of some of the symptoms, of some of the things that are happening in a child's brain, and some of the ways that you can support them, especially through that regulate, relate, reason method. Just say that over and over and over in your head. Regulate, relate, reason, regulate, relate, reason, regulate, relate, reason. Not jump right to the consequence, not jump right to, oh, you should have. Do your best to start with regulate. And if you'll do that, I think you'll see a significant decrease in the stress and anxiety that your children are experiencing. I am so excited to be back with you again. In a few weeks, we'll be talking about loving limits. July 9th at 2 p.m., I'll be talking about some other discipline strategies. Today, we talked about regulate, relate, reason as a way to help children calm down and regulate themselves. Next time, we'll be talking about discipline, and if the regulate, relate, reason doesn't work, or if it does, but you feel like there still needs to be a consequence to their actions, we'll be talking about that again next time. So join me back here July 9th at 2 p.m. And as always, make sure that you follow MisterStuTV on YouTube and YouTube Kids. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Make sure to follow us everywhere so that you don't miss out on any of the mental health fun, and we can make tough emotions child's play together. Until next time, make sure that you spread the word and share the love. See you soon. Peace.